Pastor Corey here once again for your weekly Facebook devotional. And so today I am standing in my backyard, and behind me is the play set that we got for our oldest daughter Adeline about 2 years ago. And Vivi wasn't born yet, and Addie will be 5 on next month on May 19th, which is crazy for Jess and I to even think about, but that really doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about. So let's get back on track. So this play set took me the better part of 2 days to put together. And let's just be real, I did not build it from scratch. I am no Bob Vila, I'm no Chip Gaines. What I did was I took the instruction manual and took all the parts and just hoped and prayed that by the time I got to the end that I hadn't used the wrong set of screws or hadn't used the wrong board in one place and get to the end and realize that I'm one board short or one set of screws short. And so I'm not much of a carpenter. And so that goes on with the list of other things gifts I don't have. Like I'm not much of a singer, I'm not much of a gardener, not much of a carpenter and builder, but there's one thing that I do know. Having a strong foundation is vitally important and necessary. And so without this, the whole structure would come crashing down. And so that is why when I put this together, I made sure that the foundation of it was secure, was solid. And then when I got done, I made sure to use the anchors to secure it even more. Having a strong foundation is not only vitally important and necessary for construction and buildings, it's also vitally important for our lives as well. And so what we're going through right now, if there's ever a time that our life's foundation needs to be built on something that is strong and secure and will last, it is now. And we see a biblical principle and a key spiritual truth about building our life's foundation. And we see that from a parable that Jesus tells us in Luke chapter 6, verses 46 through 49, when Jesus says these words. "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I will show you what he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when a flood arose, the stream broke against that house and could not shake it, because it had been built well. But the one who hears and does not do them is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the stream broke against it, immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great." So for many people, when you heard me tell that story, it took you back to when you were a kid, and you remember the song that we were taught. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock, and the rains came tumbling down. And many of you started singing that song with me, and you could finish those lyrics to that song. And so when we think about this parable, we think about that song. And see, a parable is an earthly story that communicates a spiritual principle. And so within each parable, what we are to do is to understand what is the spiritual principle within the context in which it was written, and then how can we extract that and apply that to our lives today. And so as we look at this story, that is what we're going to try to do. And so one of the main issues in this parable is foundation versus no foundation. And the main earthly image that Jesus is using is the building of a house. And so as we previously mentioned, with any house or structure, the foundation is vitally important and necessary to have a strong, durable, reliable building. And in the time period in the area in which Jesus lived, making sure that you had a strong foundation was extremely important, and building a house was extremely difficult. And so what they had to do is they had to build their houses during the summer months. They couldn't build it during the winter months because it was rainy season and the ground was just not capable of you building on that. And so they had to build it during the summer months. But the difficult aspect of that was during the summer months, it was hot and dry, and the ground was so hard and baked that it was very much more difficult to build. And so they had to make sure that they dug down and put it on the bedrock, because if they did not, when the rainy season came, if there was not a strong foundation and that ground got very soggy and very unstable, then the walls of the house would just come crashing down. Now, in many places, the bedrock might only be a few inches below the ground. In some places, it might be several feet. And so it would be very easy for those builders, the ancient builders, to just decide, you know what, we're not going to dig all the way down there. It's too hard. It takes too long. But if they wouldn't have done that, it would have been a disaster if they had not dug down and built on the bedrock. Because if the house is built on the bedrock, it doesn't matter if the ground turns to soup. The building will stand firm and will have a strong foundation. It will be sturdy because it's not relying on the consistency of the ground for stability. It is relying on the consistency of the bedrock. Because you see, the consistency of the ground will change, but the consistency of the bedrock will not. And so one key spiritual principle that Jesus is telling us through this parable is build your life's foundation on me. So he's comparing a person building their life's foundation on him to the ancient Israelites building their house's foundation on the bedrock. And so someone may say, well, how do I build my life's foundation on Jesus? Well, I'm glad you asked. And Jesus is too, because if you look in verse 47, he makes it very clear how we're to build our life's foundation on him. When he says this, everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I will show you what he is like. So in order for us to build our life's foundation on Jesus, we must first come to him. When he calls us and draws him to himself, we must first come to him. The second thing that we have to do is that we have to hear his words. And the third thing we have to do is do what his words say to do. So if I'm someone who wants to build my life's foundation on Jesus, I must come to him when he calls. I must be someone who hears him when he speaks, that I take in what he says, I process and comprehend it, and then I hear it and I obey. Because the Greek word here, for the word hear, is akuo, and it has the implicit meaning of both hearing and obedience. So we have to come, we have to hear, and we have to do what he says to do. We have to carry out his commands. We have to execute them, not just merely know them, but do them. So we see that Jesus is saying, build your life's foundation on me, and you do that by coming to me, by hearing my words, and by doing what my words say. Now, I think there's also one other very important aspect to this parable. And so, as we look at this parable, we see that there's two different aspects to this story. You've got the wise man and the foolish man, and although their stories are different, they also have similar aspects to them as well. And there's one very important aspect that is similar between both of their stories, and that's this: the flood and the storms come and hit both the person who builds their house upon the rock and the person who builds their house upon the ground. Why is this important? It's important because it helps us to understand that being a disciple and follower of Jesus doesn't mean that we are exempt from the storms of life. As my senior pastor in Louisville, Ken, used to say all the time, being a Christian doesn't protect you from life. Disciples of Jesus are still going to experience loss and hurt and neglect and persecution and struggling. Life is not fair. Life is full of struggle, and being a Christian does not exempt us from that. COVID-19 is going to affect both Christians and unbelievers. We as Christians are not going to be exempt from the effects of this pandemic. But earlier, as I was talking about the ground in which Jesus lived, I said the consistency of the ground will change, but the consistency of the bedrock will not. Let me say it this way now. The consistency of our world will change, but the consistency of Jesus will not. The consistency of our world will change. Where we live, how much money we make, if we get richer or poorer, our health, if it gets better or worse, those around us we love, whether we have strengthened relationships with them or whether those relationships are broken through hurt or loss. The government, those who are in power, who lead us, the rules of our land, whether we're in lockdown or quarantine or not. The consistency of our world will change. And if there's ever a time that we know that, it's now, because within the last month and within the last several days, our worlds have changed drastically. So the consistency of our world will change, but the consistency of Jesus will not. He has been the same since before the world began. He was the same 2,000 years ago when he took on fleshly body and walked among humanity and then suffered and died for our sins on Calvary and rose again 3 days later. He is still the same today as he sits at the right hand of his Father and rules and reigns with him. And he will be the same forevermore and throughout all eternity. See, guys, the consistency of our world will change, but the consistency of Jesus will not. So as we close, the storms of life are here right now, and they will continue to come throughout the remainder of our lives. The question, and what I want to challenge each one of us with, is this: what is your life's foundation built upon? And how well will your life's foundation stand up through the storms? What is your life's foundation built upon? And how well will your life's foundation stand up through the storms? MHBC family and friends, know that we love you, we're praying for you, we miss you, and that if you or someone you know needs anything, just remember we're a phone call away.